Serapeum and from Nemos News Network. Dustin, thanks for joining me as always. Dustin, we've
You've
talked
got it.
about
Pleasure to be here.
issues that we both care deeply about. That is biblical issues, religious issues, historic issues. I don't take issue with your contention that from a biblical standpoint,
Sorry, I
there was
froze
this
up a little bit
event.
there. My bad internet.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me okay? Um,
Yeah, now I can hear
oh,
you fine.
okay. I mean, I think that your claims with regard to the origins in the Bible of this race of giants emanating out of space, that's entirely biblical. That is entirely plausible. And in fact, to back that up, I don't know if you're following a recent development in Israel where Israeli scientists and archaeologists have uncovered underneath the city of Ashdod, which is one of the great Philistine cities, these gigantic blocks that could only have been created by
Mhm.
some giants. It's there's no real other way to explain
All
it.
yeah, all
And
over the
that the
world you find those.
Philistines
They're called
all
megalithic.
over
Yeah,
exactly, but the Philistines
yeah,
are described or seem to it's implied at least in the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and in the first and second books of Samuel, that they were a giant peoples that came in from the sea. No one knows the exact
yeah,
origins, but they were the ancient
yeah,
enemies of Israel. And in fact, they were only
yeah.
defeated by King David. And at that point, they disappeared from the pages of history. So I only bring it up because it sort of validates your speculation with regard to this race of giants. Um,
Well, they're quite common. Yeah.
yeah,
They dug one up from a tomb, a sarcophagus beneath the Notre Dame Cathedral when it burnt down. I mean, it was not a big giant, but it was a 7-foot elongated skull knight who was entombed there. So these things are actually quite common. And they don't talk about it. It's forbidden science.
right. And I think I've also heard you make reference to the people in Britain that were there before the Romans arrived, who, the Druids who were involved with maybe the creation of the Stonehenge, which is not explainable by today's science, and which the nursery rhyme "Fee fi fo fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman" comes from. Because when the Anglo-Saxons started to settle in England, they found this enemy that they had to confront.
Yes.
So,
And that is an ancient Gaelic dialect meaning seafood sufficient for my hunger, good to eat.
mm,
And it doesn't just mean, it's not just a child's fairy tale. It actually has a basis in reality. And this is one of many lineages of giants that were all over the world, as common as dinosaur bones.
right, and you also have embraced what I think is also a reasonable theory that emanates from the Bible, and that was popularized in late 19th century Britain, generally called the British Israel theory, which claims that the 10 tribes that were lost to history, according to the Talmud, actually made their way into Europe, where they established the great civilizations of Europe. Uh, Germany, Britain, France, maybe Russia. These were the great, and that I think that it's a reasonable evidence to suggest that these civilizations are at the forefront of all of human advancement. I mean, they, in every area, science, philosophy, the arts, morality, law, and that it does seem to me a reasonable speculation that they very well may be descended from the lost 10 tribes and that they also have inherited, even though they're not conscious of it, the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up an image here to just as one of
Thank
the
you.
many evidences, so to speak. It doesn't seem to show up on my list. I'm trying to
Okay.
there it is. Different tab. Excuse me. Okay, so this is,
Yep.
forgive my art. I'm no artist. I'm not a meme maker. But this is one of the many biblical prophetic evidences. This is actually America and the UK founding dates that came exactly 70 times 7, or if you do the math, That's 2,520 years after the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim were conquered by the Assyrians. So they were punished exactly according to 70 times 7. And then you see the punishment was lifted, and these Israelite nations were gifted back to them essentially after their punishment was over. And now you see the modern Europeans, I think, if you do the math and you look at the founding dates, would match up as well. But this example is just the U.S. and the UK prophesied by God.
Okay.
According to Leviticus 26:18 for those who are not watching.
Right. And if ye will not yet for all this hearken. Well, that's the quote that you run from Leviticus.
Yeah.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, then I will punish you.
This is where I take issue with you, because you have said, and I think rightfully, that you look to the King James Bible as a very definitive translation of the canon of the Bible, which includes, of course, what Christians call the Old Testament, and what is including in the New Testament, and all of the Gospels and writings, particularly of St. Paul. And yet you say that when the Assyrians took away the 10 tribes of Israel, they also took away the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. And, I think that
I don't think I've said that.
No? Okay, well, all right. I thought you had during our last program. Maybe I'll stand corrected. I guess
not all the tribes were conquered.
Right, but I think that the Bible tells us that, and in fact, the books of Chronicles and the books of Kings, Second Kings, tells us that the 10 tribes were taken away by the Assyrians, but the tribe of Judah and Benjamin were not. They survived. Jerusalem survived, and that the tribes of Judah and Benjamin include both Judah and Benjamin, but also elements of Levi and Simon were also part of that. And that those
I have no contention with that.
Okay. I just want to do a little chronology here, because that kingdom continued.
Go ahead.
Okay, that kingdom continued until
there's a small delay because I have satellite.
Well, okay, well, let's take our time, because we're having all kinds of technical things here. All right, the kingdom continued until, according to the book of Chronicles, Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian destroyed the first temple and took away a very large portion of that kingdom into captivity in Babylon on the banks of the Euphrates River. That's where we get the prophet Ezekiel was a part of that, and it's like, by the river of Babylon did I weep, thinking of my homeland of Zion. And I think it's also biblical in the King James Bible that when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylonia, and he's called the Great for this reason, because he issued a decree that is republished in the book of Ezra, which is part of the King James Bible, where he called upon the exiled Jews, or Judeans, as it were, or Judahites, to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild their temple. And that's exactly what they did, under the leadership of Ezra the scribe and his general Nehemiah. And then the book of Ezra.
They also had a racial purity. They had a racial purity test, and they put off those.
Yes, he did
not prove their lineage.
When he got back to Israel, he forced all of the Judean men to divorce their non-Jewish wives, basically, and kind of reconstitute the Jewish people. I mean, you could say by today's standards he was an extremist, but we're judging it now. In those days, these things were
biblical standards.
Right.
In biblical standards, Israelites are a pure race.
That's right, and he wanted it to be
and they're actually commanded not to mix.
That's right, and he also brought out of the temple, once it was consecrated, a scroll which he read publicly to thousands of people, and that began the establishment of what we call today the synagogue, because you had people go back to their villages and towns and create these places of worship where they would read that scroll in an organized way, and they would do so every day. So That was the beginning of what we now call, I would argue, Rabbinic Judaism. That's also in the book of Ezra. And I think that it's safe to
I
say
would
that,
contest that.
how so?
According to, I don't have the quote right in front of me. I'll have to pull it up. But according to some of the top rabbinical authorities, Judaism was essentially a continuation of Phariseeism. So it was never really the Old Testament Hebrew faith, Hebrewism, you could call it, pre-Christian Hebrewism. It was an extension of the Babylonian Talmud of the Pharisees, who were never
Well,
enslaved.
The Babylonian Talmud came many centuries later. I mean, and yes, it was Pharisaic. I mean,
Well,
the Pharisees.
It's been orally passed down since the time of Babylon.
Oh, it's been orally passed down since Moses, according to Judaic understanding. I mean, when Moses received the Torah at Sinai, the Torah itself says
He
that he
wrote down
also
what he found.
received. Well, he did, but it also said that he received a body of ordinances and laws and precepts and all of the rest as commentary. And the tradition, and this is consistent with traditions in
Well,
a
essentially,
lot of indigenous people, that there was an oral tradition that was passed down from Moses to the elders, to the judges. Eventually, it made its way down to the rabbis of the Second Commonwealth period. That's the Jewish tradition. Now,
historically, though,
you and I can.
this is a myth.
All right. Well, I would contend that there's more evidence that it's true. We can disagree on that, I hope.
Just simply consider, this one argument, and it's not concise, it's general. But the things that Moses received from Yahweh were written in stone. And essentially, Talmudic Judaism are claiming that they heard something that was passed down many times. And we all know how that, I don't know what they call it, the circle game or the phone game or something, where it doesn't end up the same as it began anyway. So until it was published much later as the Talmud, and Jesus referred to it as the tradition of the elders.
Well, that's not what I'm talking about, the
constantly.
tradition of the elders. What Moses received in stone was the Ten Commandments. But he also received the entire body of law and ethics and the blueprint for how we're to live our lives and how nations are to conduct their affairs and how individuals are to conduct their affairs in terms of personal relations, business relations, sexual relations. Yeah, I mean, but that's part of the book of King
That's
James.
all in the Torah.
Exactly, and that's the Torah is King James Bible. That's part of it. And that all emanated from the revelations of Sinai. Okay. So we have,
just briefly on King James Bible, it basically, King James and the scribes that had worked on it lifted the content completely from the works of Tyndale before it. So I would actually consider the Tyndale or Thomas Matthews Bibles to be more accurate. There were some strange changes and a lot of Freemason symbolism in the original 1611 King James Bible. People can find it online. So I don't fully trust it or its sources, but it's more accurate than a lot of modern Bibles for sure. I don't want to defend it.
No, okay, I understand. I mean, look, as a Jew, I consider the actual Hebrew Torah to be the closest thing to the revelation at Sinai and the Word of God, and that was translated into Greek by the Septuagint, which is a day of mourning in Judaism because there was mistranslated words. They felt like by doing that, and by the way, it was done by rabbis in Alexandria, but nevertheless, you can't translate literally Hebrew into another language without losing certain meanings and without changing certain things. So there's a problem with that. And then, of course, the Septuagint was translated into Vulgate by the Roman Catholics. And by the way, the Catholics, the early church, are to be credited with developing a concept that was completely embraced by the rabbis. And that was to divide the Torah into what we call pashas, sections that are read on the Shabbos every weekend during the weekdays. And they did it in a way that was very acceptable. But the point is that the Vulgate, I think, provided the basis for Wycliffe and eventually the King James Bible. So there have been, every time it's reinterpreted into another language, by like anything else that's interpreted, you lose certain essences because you have to change the meaning of certain words that don't necessarily ascribe to the original meaning. So what you're putting up something? What's this?
Yeah, I think people should study. Yeah, I think people should study the words. I'm trying to add some context to topics that you're going through here,
Please.
just as I can think of it. This one is sort of a breakdown between the Hebrew Masoretic and the Greek Septuagint in terms of who biblically endorsed which one. It seems as though the Greek Septuagint has a pretty good accuracy rate,
Right.
and there aren't any, you know, apostolic or biblical authorities that are really pointing toward the Hebrew Masoretic. And I definitely do not trust the Catholic, the Vulgate, and I definitely don't trust their Dewey Rhymes or any of the other Bibles that they've put out, because those were political animals completely, with clear doctrinal issues and clear-cut edits.
Okay. I mean, I think you and I agree on that. I would only add to that that the
I have a
Septuagint.
debate. Yeah,
No, the Septuagint
sorry, I have a debate
itself.
coming up with a Catholic apologist about this.
Oh, okay. No, and I would be on your side on that one because just from a scientific, logical standpoint, whenever you have a translation, it's going to be influenced by the people that are doing the translating, and also the differences of language there are certain words that can't be exactly translated. I would say the same thing applies to the Septuagint, even though it's probably the best translation. Nevertheless, it's still a translation. The original language was Hebrew because that was the language of God. All right. So,
People absolutely should go through the study of the words. I think people should have like a concordance, at least one. People should have a sort of a book of the definition of biblical names. There's a really small, really cheap, very easy to get. I think people should do a deep dive of the study of the words themselves, because it reveals more of the mysteries of the Torah. I mean, I don't know how better to say it to people.
oh, absolutely. And you should study it alongside the Hebrew and what, because we could get closer to the actual literal meaning. I mean, Hebrew exegesis leads to like a literal understanding of every single word and every single letter and what it originally meant and how it was transcribed. But bringing things up to the Second
I want to add.
Commonwealth period, please.
Okay.
All
Well, I
right.
was going
So
to add that there are
please.
there are two major forms of Hebrew. There's the Paleo Hebrew and more modern Hebrew, and they're different. So people should
They are.
understand that there
No,
are different forms of
yeah,
Hebrew.
modern Hebrew has been adapted to the modern world as a spoken language, and it was brought back as the
Yiddish,
spoken
yeah,
language of Israel. It has nothing to do with Yiddish. Yiddish is a
yeah.
Germanic language. Hebrew it's close to the
It's
ancient
very
Hebrew,
very
but
close.
it is, but it
Well,
is
they
modernized.
so the history was when Khazaria adopted Judaism as the official religion of the kingdom. They actually forced their entire kingdom to start practicing Hebrew characters with the Yiddish language, and that's kind of where it originated in the southern steppes of Russia around Khazaria.
Okay, I completely reject that theory, and let me tell you why. First
I
of
know.
all, the only definitive information we have about Khazaria as is from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. He was a Sephardic rabbi in Spain who actually went to Constantinople because he wanted to go to Khazaria to meet the king. He had heard that this king had converted to Judaism, which I think is historical and accurate. He couldn't go there because it was too dangerous. He ended up going to Palestine, or at that time it was South Syria. It was a province of the Ottoman Empire, where he was murdered as he approached the gate of Jerusalem. His book, The Kuzari, is the definitive
Yeah,
text on
I'm
Khazaria,
losing you a
and
little
it's
bit.
a fantastic book. Hello? Okay, we seem to have lost Dustin. I think he'll be back shortly. Anyhow, the Kuzari is seen as the definitive book regarding the kingdom of Khazaria. And
Am I back?
yes, you are. Okay, so the Kuzari
Sorry, am I
is
back?
yes, you are, Dustin. Can you hear me okay?
Oh,
All right. So the Kuzari
thank
is
you.
the
Yeah, we're
definitive
back.
book
I'm
on,
sorry. It must have
we
been a
are,
cloud.
no problem, is the definitive book on Khazaria. Khazaria was a Turkic loose confederation of tribes that had not much of a central government. The king probably did convert to Judaism, as did his immediate household. The likelihood of that entire country becoming Jewish is not really all that plausible. And what I would suggest is that the Ashkenazic Jews primarily immigrated from Western Europe in the century before and the century during the Protestant Reformation, because they were exiled. They were exiled first from Spain, and then from France and Germany and other countries. There was a major move to get rid of the Jews of Western Europe, and they went to Poland because the Polish king, Casimir the Great, welcomed them in. Maybe there's rumors that he did so because he was having an affair with a Jewish prostitute. Fine. The point is, he did it. They came to Poland. They settled in what is now called the Pale of Settlement. And the proof of that is twofold. First of all, the language of Yiddish is a Germanic language primarily. It's Old German. That's the region which these Jews emigrated from, particularly around the Rhine Valley. And, there are some Turkic words in there. Maybe there was some Khazarians mixed in. There's no question about that. There are also some Old French words, there are Hebrew words, and there are Slavic words. But a study of the linguistic element of Yiddish shows that it's not a Turkic language, it's a Germanic language. A German person can understand Yiddish. It's mostly German words. I'm not
That's
a
very
deep
true.
dive into Yiddish.
There are a lot of overlaps, and there are a lot of mixed words in that language. They have
Well, it's more
traveled
than overlap.
around and
The
picked up a
language
lot of.
essentially is Germanic. It's Old German. I mean,
Well, also,
I can know.
as the myth, the myth of the Ashkenazi Judaic tribe basically falls apart with the term Ashkenaz, which is Japhetic. It's not even Semitic to begin with. The whole
term
thing just falls
Ashkenaz
apart
means German.
historically and biblically in terms of.
The Torah calls Germany
It's
Ashkenaz.
through Gomer of Japheth.
Yeah, that's because that's where they were from. They lived in Germany for many centuries before they moved east after being expelled. Just like Sephardic
But that doesn't mean that they're
means
from
Safad.
Shem.
Well, wait a minute. Sephardic means Safad, which is also
you would generally.
It's the Jewish word.
This is one of the confusions of the term Jew in the Bible, which was introduced in the 1800s. When you confuse a region like Judea with a bloodline or a lineage, genealogically, like Yahudim or of Judah, the whole Bible starts to get confused and cluttered in a lot of different places. And when you confuse, Ashkenaz of Japheth with being a Semite of Shem, it just confuses biblical. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
All right. Look,
etymologically, genealogically, it doesn't make sense chronologically in many. So, yeah.
Okay. My understanding on this is that the reason why Ashkenazi Jews are called Ashkenazi is because the word Ashkenaz is the biblical name for Germany. It's the Ashkenaz who were descended from Shem. And I mean, that's the third son or something like that. And the reason Sephardic Jews are called Sephardic is because the word Sephard is the biblical word for Spain. It had more to do with the fact that that's where they settled. They started settling in those regions actually during Roman times. And eventually it's just another word for saying German Jew or Spanish Jew. Ashkenaz or Sephard.
There were many Judeans who said they were Judeans, but were not. So in the Bible, it says there were many Judeans who said they were Judeans, but were not Judeans or of Judah, Yahudim. Now that word has been changed since the 1800s to the word Jew, but in essence, there's this biblical issue of a false tribe pretending to be of Judah. And that carries on to this situation or any other situation where you see a tribe taking the name. It's sort of like, it's like when African migrants moved to France or Sweden, they're not French and they're not Sweden, according to the historical standard. Now they're changing that historical standard, but it's a word manipulation. It's not an actual lineage. And that's important to understand. That's happened a lot historically.
what I would suggest is that the word Jew, which does appear in the Bible, in the book of Esther, by the way, it's just a shortened way of saying Judean. There's no difference. A Judean is a Jew. I mean, it became the word Judean went out of style after Hadrian destroyed the infrastructure of a Judean state with the crushing of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So it was just shortened to Jew. That's my contention. It's not really, it's very close to Jew, and it's in the same way that the word France is a shortened word for Francia, which were the original
There's
settlers
there's a
of Frank.
Yahweh put a curse on anyone who changes the Bible. So if you change the word Bible from Yahudim or Judean to the word Jew, you go to hell. You're cursed. All the plagues and curses within the Bible
Well,
are upon you. This would
honestly,
apply to anyone who
Dustin,
changes the Bible to the word Jew.
yeah, and I honestly don't think that it does change it. It's just a shortened, it's an abbreviated word.
Sorry,
The
it's a
word
little laggy.
Judean.
I'm going to cut video just so we have a better audio because I don't want to sacrifice audio.
Great. The word Judean still is formally the word that describes the Jewish people. It's just it after the loss of sovereignty, it was shortened to Jew, but it didn't change it. It's just it's like you call, England isn't called the same as it was in medieval times. I mean, these are, words take on a bit of a different pronunciation basically, but the actual substance of it and the essence of it hasn't changed. Are you there, Dustin?
I would disagree. In fact, I would disagree. I would say that it has confused the issue dramatically because you've mixed the term there of a people that live in a region like Judea with a tribe, a family, a bloodline that are all related, who are
Yes.
a pure bloodline, never to mix with other bloodlines, who are of the family of Judah, or the term Yahudim originally. So essentially, you're changing, you're mixing. It's like saying you're an American, but you're also a European American at the same time. But
Well, you
you're
could say
not.
you're you
You
could
know,
say you're
it
a
doesn't. It
German
just changing the
American
word has
or a
confused
French
the issue. And
American.
in
I mean, I
for
think that
example, I'm gonna I'll present a quote from.
no. Yep.
Let's see, uh, there. So 1980 Jewish Almanac. It says, quote, strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call an ancient Israelite a Jew or to call a contemporary Jew an Israelite or Hebrew. Now, this used to be kind of admitted, but in modern, I don't know, last 100 years, the revisionism of history has deleted most of the alternative evidence.
Look, I would
It's gotten
argue
very
that
bad to try to find the
no, I mean,
truth.
I think that they all describe the same thing, and the word Jew does appear in the book of Esther, which was in Persian times, even before the Greeks. That Mordecai is called Mordecai the Jew. So it's just an abbreviation. Let's move on to another thing. We can disagree on this. I would argue that Judean and Jew are interchangeable. It's the same people, the children of Judah, the children of Israel. And what I would suggest is that if we run under the assumption that the British Israel theory is true and that the great empires of Europe are descended from the lost 10 tribes, then the people of Judah, the Jews, are descended from those two tribes, and we're partners in that way. We've all inherited the covenant. Now, did we have mixed into us people that are not a part of the covenant? Was there intermarriage? Yes, there was on all sides. I mean, there are no pure races. I mean, do you think that the
They would be
10 tribes who made their way to Europe,
they would
you
be
don't think that
excluded.
excuse me?
Just like just like after they came back from Babylon, they could not be considered Israelites, and a true prophet would have made that division. Now, I'm not saying we have any such authority or anything like that today, but speaking on behalf of the Bible, because it's what it says, you cannot be a mixed person or of a mixed lineage and also be an Israelite. My children are not Israelites; they're mixed. I'm probably not pure-blooded Israelite because I have brown hair and brown eyes, but
So then
Caucasian,
nobody is a pure
blonde-haired,
Israelite by
blue-eyed
that.
people of the tribes of Europe fulfill all of the prophecies of the Bible, including forgetting who they were. Well, many such
Listen,
people exist, but it is down to about 10% or less of the world. It is under attack by the synagogue of Satan.
Well, look, first of all, I think that
as
there
according
is
to
no
prophecy.
such thing as a pure race. I mean, of a pure, pure bloodline. People, every generation has
That's
some
not what the Bible.
intermarriage.
That's not what the Bible says.
Well, I think that's what has
And
happened.
also, God promises to preserve those tribes. The tribes of Israel would be promised to preserve by God. So,
Okay.
he's preserving his pure tribe, which was promised by his rules to never mix. It's a circular logic, because in a debate, you can't win this. It always goes back to the Bible says it can't happen. So therefore, modern interpretation's thrown out. Sola scriptura, the Bible says so, therefore it is.
Well, let's say that,
And
let's
this is
use
what I
that
get into with
argument.
Catholics as well, because they have all these extra
Mm,
biblical sources.
okay. Well, what I would suggest then, and as I've said, I strive to believe in the Bible as a Jew, as the Torah. That's my mission. That's my goal. That's what I ascribe to. That if that's true, and that there has to be a remnant of pure blood Jewish, children of Israel, I would argue that
Yeah.
the Jewish people are about as
They're in
close
Iceland.
to that. Excuse me?
They're the most mixed people on earth, and they have fulfilled none of the prophecies. And they're also a minor people of only 2% or less of the population. They don't fulfill any prophecy in the Bible. It can literally only be blonde, blue-eyed Europeans. And they are basically left to Iceland. That's the only country left that we have.
Which is a pure race, white
We are almost
race.
we're nearly
Although,
extinct. Yes.
let me just, I mean, I was going to comment on two things, and I will get to it. But as far as Iceland is concerned, my understanding is that Iceland is populated by a mix of Nordic people and Irish slaves, because when the Vikings settled Iceland, they would stop in Ireland and
Israelites.
enslave.
Yes.
So it's not a pure race either. But the point I'm
All
making
of
here
those are
is that
Israelites. They're different. They're different tribes of Israel, though, so they're still Israelites.
I
These are the
thought you
lost
said that
tribes.
the Celtic people were like a descendant from the giants. Weren't they the people that were there before the
No, they were
Anglo-Saxon
Celtic
war?
giants, and they fought them. So for example, like in Irish, every continent has their own sort of name for them. In the Irish mythology, you had like the Tuatha, and you had the different names for them in like the Celtic and Gaul
Mhm.
mythologies. But the Nordic peoples and the Irish peoples and the Celtic peoples, these were the lost tribes of Israel
But are you suggesting that they had no
that
intermarriage
eventually
with the
founded
natives?
Europe.
I mean, Dustin, are you suggesting that
I'm
these lost
suggesting that
tribes?
if they had I'm not saying it didn't happen at all, but I'm
Right.
suggesting if they were to intermarry together, then they're just cousins of Israelites. Therefore, it's still okay. They're still pure-blooded Israelites. If one tribe mixes with another tribe of Israelites, that's still an Israelite.
Well, what if they were mixing with the
And
giants,
that
or who were native when they arrived
also
there?
for those who study the genetics of this and who actually study the anthropology and the lineage and people movements, the etymology and such, the Caucasian European race were genetically quite pure and unmixed with almost every outsider, with the exception of Muslim conquests and rapes in jihads of Europe, because that was pretty
Mhm.
common throughout the last
Right.
couple hundred years. Much of Europe has already been lost, like Constantinople, etc. So, with the exception of that, which had a browning effect on much of Europe, the Caucasian race did not mix with others, and it was actually a genetic imperative in many countries enforcing it by law with racial purity laws. Other people could mix, but no one could mix with whites. Now, I would have been banned from marrying a Chinese woman under those laws. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying Israelites were very serious about following God's commandments up until about 100 years ago.
All right. I mean, it seems to me that if the 10 tribes left Israel and made their way to Europe, they met populations that were probably similar to the Philistines, who had come from Europe and had invaded the coast and were the ancient enemies of the Israelites. And they probably did have intermarriage and assimilation with those tribes. I mean, that's just how nature works. They were not, they didn't,
Yeah, I can show
completely
you the
keep themselves.
prophecy on that.
Okay. But
Yeah, I'm
what
going to
I
pull
would
up
get
the
to,
specific prophecy about what would happen if they didn't, and I'll just throw it in the background. Go ahead.
what I would also argue in that same vein,
Uh,
since we're
there.
talking about an issue that's controversial, and anyway, is that the Jewish people, starting from all the way from Roman times and the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba rebellion, right up until Middle Ages and through Europe, that they maintained a very high level of racial purity. I mean, I'm sorry to talk about this. I know that it's not politically correct, but we're talking in a biblical concept here. And it's a very basic and very paramount element of the Jewish people, even to this day, even though some Jews are uncomfortable about it. That's too bad. That we marry with other Jews and that we do care about ancestry, and that it's a big no-no to marry outside of the faith. That's just a basic. And also the Cohens and the Levis, like, for example, my wife comes from a Cohen. That is an ancestry that goes back to Aaron, the brother of Moses. That's it's a
It's
lineage.
claim.
Right, and I think it's a legitimate claim.
It's
It's as
claim,
good a
but when you
claim.
get into it, essentially, the evidence is, oh, we lost it, basically,
But they
and there is
didn't.
no
It's
such
it's
evidence.
been an unbroken generation to generation ancestry that goes back to the tribe of the Kohanim, who are a subset of the tribe of Levi, and who were appointed in the Torah as the priestly, to serve the people as priests. That's something that goes back, I think, as it's as legitimate a claim as anything that you're making with regard to European countries. It's something that, I mean,
It's
how
well, it's a
else would you
claim.
explain it? I mean, do you think people suddenly
I mean, I
decide
would
to take
love
on
to
the
go
name?
through the evidence.
Sure. I mean, I
I would
don't
love
think
to go
that
through the
suddenly.
evidence. I mean, essentially, where would you like to start? I mean, anthropology, etymology, genetics, the biblical prophetic breakdown, the biblical historical part. I mean, there's so many sort of facets to this. It is a
Well, I
complicated
mean,
topic,
it
but
might be too
I've got
broad.
all of that covered.
I know you do, and I
Right.
admire
It's a
your.
huge. It would take us hours.
It
It would
would, and
take
that's
us
what I mean.
hours.
I
I've
mean,
got videos
I
that
don't know if we have the time today to
I've got
go
a
into such a deep dive, but and I will say, Dustin, I admire your scholarship. That's why I'm talking to you, and it's, I know that these are subjects that, by today's standards, are seen as politically incorrect because we are talking about, lineage, and we're talking about biblical elements, but that is a part of Judaic understanding, and it's a real thing. And I would argue that, genetically speaking, there was actually a good study that was done by the National Geographic that partially it confirms what you are saying. I looked into it because I heard Dr. E. Michael Jones, whom I've debated many times, make the claim that that study proved that the Jews are descended from the Khazars. So I looked into it. I read the article. I saw the research. It didn't say anything of the kind, but what it did discover genetically and linguistically was that the Jews are descended from tribes that existed in ancient Palestine, in Judea, but there was some mixing with um, Palestinian natives or Canaanites. I don't think there's any denying that. But it was the same genetic makeup as Palestinian Arabs, who also come from that same root. That's what they discovered.
well,
That was their research.
there's actually a ton of the various Jewish geneticists who are admitting that they have a Khazarian and Canaanite genetic lineage, and there's also
Yes.
science magazines bragging about, yeah. So in essence, you're looking at all of the evidence, including the genetic evidence, including from Jewish sources and scientists and historians and scholars and rabbis,
Okay.
all essentially saying that we're not actually Israelites. We're Khazarians who converted and then took the
I'd like
name,
to, I
and we're
don't think.
actually Edomites.
No. Well,
And
first of all, Dustin, with
it's
due respect, I'd like to see any of them saying that the Jews are descended from the Khazarians. I don't think that I haven't seen that. Canaanite, yes, there was some intermarriage. There is some elements of Jewish background there. I don't think it's significant because let's not forget the
Arthur
Canaanites were the
Koestler.
enemies. Arthur
So
Koestler
there's a
wrote the
lot of
book.
scholars
Yeah,
like Arthur
Wait a minute,
Koestler,
hold
who's
on.
Jew.
I know that book. I read it.
Yeah.
The Arthur Koestler's book, The 13th Tribe. He doesn't say that. He just basically reiterates what's in the Kuzari, which is the only really definitive source about the Khazars. And he doesn't claim that those people became, they didn't move into Poland. They disappeared. I mean, and that the vast majority of that sparsely populated country, it's not likely that they converted to Judaism. It's not likely that any group of people, en masse would convert to Judaism. It's not such an easy thing to convert to Judaism. I mean, I
essentially the
think
whole
that
nation was invited
the
in.
royal family did, but this was not a
Well,
a centralized country. It was a nomadic society.
it was a tyranny, and essentially they were all in on a scam, which was to their benefit, and they were known as a people that were immoral and violent and barbaric and would accost travelers and all sorts of things. However, at the end of the day, they essentially were invited by their Sephardic cousins, also Canaanites, also Nephilim, to join the scam, the con, which was a big antichrist lie to say that basically that the Jews were, the Edomite Jews were the Old Testament biblical Hebrews. And, Arthur says that they're all Khazars, Mongols, and Huns. They're not Israelites or even Semitic.
They were. I mean, and the Mongols, by the way,
that's
were
one
even
of
less
many.
moral. Look, I don't disagree with that. I think the Khazars were a Turkic Mongol people. They probably were not exactly, civilized. Frankly, I know that, again, that's politically incorrect. They were pre-Christian. Christianity did civilize Europe. There's no question about that. But for whatever reason, the royal family did embrace Judaism. I don't think it's really accurate to suggest that the entire country did. And evidence indicates that the Jewish people of Europe, they didn't move into Europe. They disappeared. I mean, that's not likely. The Jews of Poland, which was about 75-80% of world Jewry after the 15th century, they were Germanic. I mean, they moved in from France and Germany and the rest of Europe because they were kicked out, and I think that's historically provable. But in the broad sense,
I like to use Jewish sources for this.
Sure,
just to prove
Jewish
it.
sources.
I mean,
I don't think
just because people won't. It's a trick that I don't know who I picked it up from, but basically I don't want to seem like I'm being racist or anything. It's basically this is the historical fact. DNA research science from Dr. Aaron Eliak says
without us seeming like we're into race.
Says,
I don't think either one of us.
It is right. It is difficult.
It is, and neither one of us are racist. I mean, that's not the point here.
No, but I want to be historically accurate to the Bible. And Jewish geneticist Dr. Aaron Hayek says 97% of the 17 million of the world's Jews are not descendants of Abraham. Jewish encyclopedias admit it. Jewish scholars admit it. Jewish rabbis admit it. It's all over the biblical narrative as well. And the manifesto of the World Jewish Federation in 1935 admitted that they are Edomites. And in fact, it was a pretty long bragging quote about how we're Edomites. That's why we're different, essentially. Edomites, yes, of Edom, Esau. Which of course is in, again, you got to think of, it's the Nephilim DNA that's really the important aspect of that, because you're not just pointing out Esau, you're pointing out the Canaanite genetic that they mixed in with. The Canaanite genetics of the giants, the Nephilim, the seed of the serpent.
Right.
That's really the issue with the Edom people.
Right. And again, I don't think that it's really accurate for me to deny or for anyone to deny. And genetics do indicate that there was some mixing between the Israelites and the Canaanites. And by the way, now that I think of it, wouldn't that include the 10 tribes that moved to Europe? Didn't they also integrate with the Canaanites and the Edomites? I mean, I suppose we all did. Why would they be? Why would
no? Originally, they wiped out. Well, because they would stay genetically pure to their people as the sort of a law written on their heart, even after they forgot God's law. And this is a fact that's borne out etymologically and historically. If people want to confirm that, they were basically. They stuck to their own. And if you have these tribes that have now, Justin, you had the time of Joshua where they were told to wipe out the giants, but they didn't finish. And then from that time on, there was some mixing. And the
Thank you.
giants spread over the whole world. All the little 7-footer
Yes,
giants at that
indeed.
point had spread over the world, because Joshua failed to uphold God's
That's
commandment
right,
to,
he did.
quote, leave nothing alive in terms of the Canaanites. So that's where you get the genetics. That's where you get like all of the evidence of like the even today in the place that Goliath is from, large men are common, and the genetics still harken back to the genetics of the giants, and they've linked this to the ancient Canaanite genetics. So you've actually got like science magazines bragging about how the Bible said they were going to wipe out the giants, but haha, they're still there around, genetically. And the Bible says that they almost wiped them out and then did not obey. That's not exactly what the narrative says, but there's people that hate God in the science industry. And this is the story that is borne out in every science, from the genetics to the giant skeletons that are as common as dinosaur bones, to the archaeology, to the megalithic structures, the Cyclopean ruins, where humans came along later and built little bricks on top of megalithic stones that fit together perfectly, that were smooth and hand carved and precision drilled in the time of rocks and hand tools that could not have possibly done that. So there's all these mysteries that don't make any sense with modern science or modern theology. And then when you and you realize there's a few big lies, giants are real, and they are now pretending to be Israelites, everything changes. Everything makes sense.
All right, Dustin, let's, for the sake of argument, let's assume that you're correct about the race of giants, the Canaanites, which I'm not disputing here. Joshua was commanded by God to destroy them utterly. The Israelites failed to do it completely. In fact, there's a scene in the prophet Samuel where he actually meets up with the king of the Amalekites, and he murders him. Cuts. They said he hewn him into 4 pieces with a sword. This is at the time of King Saul.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that King Saul was criticized because he didn't finish the job. I think that it's safe to say
Mm-hmm.
that when King David reached his primacy of power and established Jerusalem as the capital, and set the stage for his son Solomon to build the temple, the Canaanites had been largely defeated, but not completely. And that, as you say, they spread across the world. They probably came from other parts of the world. In the case of the Philistines, generally they are thought of as seafaring people. They probably came from Greece. Who knows where they came from? There's a lot of theories about it. But the point I'm making here, and I want to go to this, and I'd like to see if we can get an answer, is that if the Israelites, the 12 tribes of Israel, intermarried with the Canaanites and with the Edomites, who were half Israelite, half Canaanite, because Esau had Canaanite wives. If that were the case, then why would you think that the 10 tribes of Israel had maintained a purity and did not integrate at all, versus the 2 tribes with the remnants of the other 2 of Judah? Why did they do it? I mean, what's your evidence of that? It seems to me that either they all did it or they didn't.
Well, up until about the time of Hitler, essentially, the white race as a whole, collectively, for the most part, looked down upon anyone who race mixed. And you can still see this in the old South where I'm from. Mixed couples still kind of get a weird look. My grandma was a little strange about my Asian wife at first, but my cute grandbabies won her over. So it just takes a little time, but
Well, the Jews do too. But
actually, it took a lot of time for
you're
that to
not
go
answering my
away.
question.
Yeah, it
You're
took a
not
lot of
answering
time.
my question,
Well,
which is, I mean, look, I
there
mean,
was a
Jews
racial
also don't like
purity
to.
preference, and that is borne out if you study the lineages.
Well, why do you think? Again, I'm going to ask you this again, maybe in a different way. I know that I'm kind of zeroing in here, but why would the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, the kingdom
Oh,
of
go ahead.
Ephraim, thank you, why would they have maintained such purity, whereas the 2 tribes of the south didn't? I mean, what evidence do you have of that? Seems to me they all either did or didn't. There's no
Well, they
biblical
did,
evidence.
but the tribes that you're saying are the tribes that you're claiming are the 2 tribes. You basically, like, if you don't consider the modern Jews to be those 2 tribes, and specifically the tribe of Judah, then you don't have this issue. You don't have this problem. The tribes of Judah and Levi did not mix for the most part, just like the rest
Right.
of the Israelite tribes. And,
So then what
as I
happened to
said,
the tribes
every
of
single
Judah and
biblical
Levi?
prophecy that has been fulfilled by one group of people. Historically, I don't have a quick and easy answer for you. I can walk you through what happened to most of the tribes and where they went, sort of their long journey,
Well, what about
specific
Judah
names
and
that they were
Benjamin?
known
What
by, like
happened to them?
Scythians and Sumerians and others.
Right. My question to you is this, because this
I
is
will
how we
have to go back
started.
to my lineage notes and go,
Well, wait a
because
minute,
I don't remember
Dustin. This,
off the top of
this
my
was
head.
how we started the program, and I was using King James Bible to back this thesis up. That the tribes of Judah and Benjamin
Mm-hmm.
were separated from the 10 tribes. They were not taken away into captivity by the Assyrians. They came back, according to the book of Ezra, from
Till later.
exile, and they established the second commonwealth. The story of Hanukkah was their independence against the Syrian Greeks, and that Jesus was of that tribe, and the Pharisees were of that tribe, and that they were eventually just the political system was destroyed by the Romans when they destroyed the first temple and crushed the Bar Kokhba rebellion. At that point, they had settled all across the Roman Empire. Why would, I mean, that doesn't, that's, I think, not only biblically accurate.
They were conquered by Babylon. Well, they were conquered numerous times by Babylon as well as Rome. And then they were scattered the same way that you saw much of Rome. I mean, it was destroyed and torn apart, and whole tribes relocated.
That's right. They were scattered across the Roman Empire. But,
various things. Yeah, the Vikings, then you had Islam, and you had sort of the four Roman emperors and all sorts of historical twists.
They were scattered, as you pointed out, across the Roman Empire, and had scattered themselves. They resettled in the south of France and in Italy at the time of the destruction of the temple. In fact, the Jewish communities of Spain trace their ancestry to even before Rome, as does the Jewish community of Rome, by the way. They go all the way back. They have traditions that go back to the... Okay.
I would contest their evidence.
Fine. What I'm suggesting is it seems obvious to me that at the time of the Romans, according to a lot of texts, and Josephus wrote about it in his Antiquities, the Jews settled across the Mediterranean, and they were scattered in pretty much all of the empire. And there are particular communities where they did settle in south of France, in Italy, in Spain. And those communities do trace their ancestry back to Roman times. The difference between them and the lost 10 tribes, which you say, and I'm not disputing it, constitute the great European white civilizations, is that the Jews of Europe, the Jews of the Roman Empire, retained their identity. They did not for a day deviate from that covenant. They continued to worship in their synagogues. They continued to believe in God, and they continued to try to intermarry, if you will, with each other to preserve that identity, and did so right up till modern times. I mean, that's the difference in a way. The lost 10 tribes, if you ask French people or English people, are they descended from the lost 10 tribes? They don't know this because they lost their identity. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I think you can make a case that it did. But the difference is that the Judeans or the Jews retained their identity. They never lost it for one single day. It's an unbroken chain. After the destruction of the temple,
see, the people of Israel
were the form of the
people of Israel.
Yeah.
The people of Israel were actually prophesied to lose their identity by Paul. And I may be forgetting the exact quote, but it goes something like this. Beloved, I would not that ye be ignorant of this fact, that forgetfulness has come upon Israel for her sins. Or I think it says come in part upon Israel for her sins. For the most part, God's people continually abandoned God's law. And the punishment was to forget who they were, as well as to lose their kingdoms. And that is exactly how history played out. And all of the tribes eventually were forced out of their kingdoms, forced into forgetfulness, and for the most part, forgot who they were. And now you're seeing a reemergence of that as the curse has worn off, as prophecy dictated. And that's where you sort of see this, what you call the British Israelite identity movement, or the Christian identity movement, or the seedline movement, or whatever people refer to it as. And I debate people even in the seedline movement about some of the specifics. But I'm undefeated in terms of debate with rabbis, with scientists, and coming up soon with a Catholic apologist. Because this is essentially, this is the historical facts. It's pretty hard to debate it. It's pretty easy to prove it. It's just that people don't want to look at it.
Justin, first of all, I don't ascribe to the epistles of St. Paul. That is a Christian thing. It's not, and I think that even amongst Christianity, there are some major differences with some of his writings. I think he was obviously quite wrong when he suggested that the Jewish people disappeared. We haven't disappeared. We have retained. There has not been
I'm
a
sorry,
single
you lagged
day.
out a bit.
I'm sorry. That Paul was not right about claiming that the Jewish people had disappeared. We have not disappeared. There has not been a single day where the sun has gone up on this planet.
The real Israelites have disappeared as prophecy dictated.
Not all of them. Because the people of Judah and Benjamin are also part of two of the Israelite tribes, and we did not disappear. We're here.
Even if you could prove lineage to Judah, which I don't think that you can, and I think that's a well-known fact.
It's self-evident
in that actual research community. However, even if you could, being mixed would no longer make you an Israelite. You cannot be both a Mamzer and an Israelite. So even according to the Torah, which you claim to follow, the law says that you are not an Israelite if you're mixed, and that you're not to mix if you're an Israelite. So ergo, it's a circular logic. You can't be both. There is no modern tribe of Judah refound.
Okay, but what I would suggest is that within the Judean or Jewish community, while there has been some mixing, there has been a core of pure Jews that continue to this day, and it's more likely the case than the 10 tribes who do not know their identity and who mixed with their surrounding nations. But putting that aside, within the Jewish community, right up from the time of Moses, where you had the mixed multitude, who, by the way, were not Jewish, who became part of the community. Nevertheless,
can I comment on that?
You can, but let me just finish my thought. Moses was quite clear that they were to be considered to be of the Israelites, and that there has always been a core, the Levites, the Kohanes, and others. I would even argue my own ancestry, the Moscowitz means son of Moses, that there has been a pure group that has not intermarried with the Gentile world. That's not to say that it's completely the case. There has been a lot of intermarriage, but either way, what I would suggest is that there has not been a day that has gone by since the day of Adam until today that you have not had a minion of circumcised Jewish men, 10 of them, get together and say certain prayers that are required by the Torah. Not a day has gone by where that hasn't happened. And in order for them to do that, they had to know, wait a minute,
after prayers,
they had to know, and they had to be conscious of their identity as Jews. And that continues. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's a pure Jewish race. I agree with you on that. But there is within the Jewish people and within the Jewish community a high level of ancestry. That's my contention. Anyway, you're welcome to comment.
Again, I mean, basically, we'd have to go through 4, 5, 6 hours on each side to try to present our evidence. That's a long conversation.
I'd like to have you back.
We'll have to agree to we'll agree to disagree on that one.
Okay.
But basically, I don't blame anyone for not believing my theology on this. I basically have I was a lifelong atheist who had no real preference or denomination or bias, who was a studier and student of history of the deep state, and I eventually got into theology because I wanted to understand why they were into the weird stuff that they were into. And that brought me to a very deep faith in God. And I started to study the prophecies and the history, and it all played out. And essentially, the deep state worshiped the Nephilim. And that is what they consider not only their gods, but also their role models. They want to be as gods. They want to get that superhuman genetics and unlock
Agreed.
transhumanism and all these things. And it's like the same thing that happened to the pre-flood world when all flesh was corrupted, which is where we originally get the giants to begin with. And my my position is just that the giants got smaller as they diluted their DNA and became what we know of as the modern Jew, who are essentially behind every organized evil on earth. I'm trying to be polite, but it seems to be borne witness and testimony by every fact and everything that
Look,
movement to
Dustin, I can
abortion
understand
to
why
porn, everything.
I can understand why you say that, because you do have prominent Jews who are part of this so-called deep state agenda, this internationalist, amoral, world order agenda. They are Jews. They are part of it. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're behind it,
Well,
but they are certainly, wait a minute, they are certainly a part of that agenda. Um, what I would suggest is this, and I've written about this in several of my books. I cover this. In fact, I'm writing a book right now about anti-Semitism, where I'm going to probably do a chapter on it. The Jewish people were subverted to a certain degree and infiltrated in the 17th century by this false messiah who was called Shabbat Zevi. And he brought sexual immorality. He called for
familiar.
overthrowing the Torah. Wait a minute. He called for overthrowing
Yeah,
all of the
sin to
precepts,
win. Yeah.
all of the precepts of the Torah, turning the whole thing on its head as a way to bring about a messianic age, which was really satanic and antinomian. He did have a major
Yeah.
impact on Judaism. That is something that I, as a Jew, have tried to expose. A lot of the people that are part of this New World
Oh,
Order movement are part of that Sabbatian conspiracy. What I would suggest also is that around the same time, maybe a little after, Christianity was subverted by a similar movement called Illuminism. And it was likewise the overthrow of Logos, the overthrow of the order of the universe, the replacement of God by the rule of corrupt, elite cadre of people who wanted to create a one world government. This is something that we are all trying to expose now.
so I
It,
lost
it
you.
is not it is not part of the
Okay.
Mosaic covenant. Jews are involved in that, are not believe usually they're atheists anyway, but they're not believers. They don't understand the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah. They're trying to overthrow that in the same way that the
Do you mind?
Illuminists are trying to overthrow Jesus. Anyway,
What? Let me. I'm curious. Then, what is your position? What is your position on sort of the modern Talmudic mainstays like Tikkun Olam, and you've got this sort of transgender end game with Adam Kadmon, I think it's called, and you have so many Talmudic precepts which are of an anti-biblical, anti-Torah, anti-God nature. I mean, which blaspheme God, which say it's okay to have child brides of 3 years old, etc. How do you square all of these things with the Torah as a Jew who's pushing back against these things? I mean, that's I think the main
thank you
criticism
for
that a
asking.
lot of Christians have with Jews is
I
if
know
they're
that.
not all evil, then why aren't some of them fighting back?
What I would suggest is that the concept of tikkun olam, which emerged out of the Lurianic Kabbalistic schools, has been corrupted by these Sabbatians. All it is saying that by observing the Torah, by being a subject to the extra rules that God put forth for the children of Israel, like to be kosher, to observe the Sabbath, and all these other rules that are specific to the children of Israel, that they are engaging in tikkun olam, repairing the world, because by doing so, they become believers in God. They become a spiritual and ethical example, not only to themselves and to their own people, but to all of mankind. They become a light unto the nations. That is the original understanding of tikkun olam, which has been corrupted by the Sabbateans, who view it as creating a man-made world order, which is completely contrary not only to the Torah, but to Jewish tradition. Now, as far as the Talmud goes, I've heard these sorts of claims and quotes in the Talmud. I think that people extract things from the Talmud to fit their agenda. The Talmud is very much influenced by the Greek methodologies of dialectic. In other words, if you read like the works of Plato, and you read the works of not so much Aristotle, but some of the other Greek schools, they have a tendency to sit around a table and each one of them brings up very contradictory ideas. And then they write them all down and they have a debate over each one of them. It's like a roundtable discussion. I think that the style of the Talmud is like that because, after all, Judaism was influenced by Greece. I mean, they were under the Greek control for many centuries. So you have in the Talmud things that are completely, by the way we would view them, completely crazy stuff. But it's not, something that the Talmud isn't like the Torah in that you have to literally follow it. It's a way to sort of open the lens and understand greater realities. It's not endorsing those things. And I think that there are questions about whether or not those things actually are in the Talmud. A lot of that was promulgated by this author, Douglas Reed, the Mysteries of Zion. And I think a lot of his research has been highly questioned. Some of it has been debunked. I'm actually trying to bring on some Talmudic experts to get into that because I'm not a Talmudic scholar. I respect the Talmud in that it goes into
what about
yeah.
Okay, I lost you for a little bit there. What about Adam Kadmon?
What about it? What is it? That's a Kabbalistic concept.
It seems to be sort of an in-game transgender androgynous obsession to turn. Yeah,
that's nonsense. What that is that you have a couple of people who are into the sex.
Okay, it seems that there's some anti-biblical Noahide laws coming. It seems that Adam Kadmon has a part to play, at least in Shabbatic doctrine. I don't know about the general, but that Shabbat is also probably the wealthiest and most influential of all the doctrines today.
Maybe
no one can deny their influence over presidents, leaders,
Justin. I don't disagree with you on that. This goes to what I was saying about this subversion of Judaism by the Sabbateans, who are a secret society, who they are the ones who may have extracted something completely out of context, out of the Torah, out of the Talmud, I should say, and claim that it justifies transgenderism. No. The Torah is clear that God created men and women in his image. And it does say men and women separately, and that the entire Jewish ethos, the Jewish life, is based upon the separation of men and women and the different roles that men and women have, equal but different within the Jewish community as a reflection of all of mankind. So if you have some radicals who are going to extract something out of the Talmud to try to make their case, you can have that. Anybody can do that kind of thing. That does not reflect the Jewish ethos. It does not reflect the Mosaic covenant. It just doesn't.
You have
and
so
I
many,
really question whether it's there.
You have so many, Jews who are out there essentially saying that anything like a law, for example, that might limit transgenderism being pushed on children, they're arguing this in front of like committees and stuff, school board meetings, is a violation of their religious rights. And you have others claiming that, that the Talmud includes 8 different genders. So this is part of where this confusion comes from. I'm glad that you're not on board that.
They don't speak for Judaism. They're radicals. They're socialists. They're part of this New World Order agenda, and they're corrupting Judaism in the same way that you have groups corrupting Christianity. I mean, I heard, for example, I've heard major Catholic politicians like Nancy Pelosi or the Cuomos say that abortion is okay because. You know what I mean? These are corrupting people who are not really part of the covenant. Look, I'm not saying that they're not Jews or Christians for that matter, but what they're advocating is very much what Shabbatai Zevi advocated, turning the Torah on its head, and everything the Torah says is good becomes evil. The Christian example, I mean, the Christian correlation is the Satanic movement, which does the same thing. I mean, it has like a black mass where you have Christian principles turned on their head. Jesus becomes Satan.
Okay.
It's a corruption of Judaism and Christianity. And I hope that religious and believing Jews and Christians, even though we may not agree on many of the specifics, we can generally agree on that.
What about the Zohar? I mean, this is the top rabbinical scholar of all time, and he
Right.
speaks of a serpent Messiah, serpent Mashiach is a quote attributed to him in one of his, I forget which book.
And who is
What is a
this top
serpent
scholar?
Messiah?
Who is this
The
top
Zohar.
scholar to which whom you refer?
The Zohar. He's referred to as the Zohar. I forget his exact name.
Well, the Zohar is a book that is one of the texts of the Kabbalah. It was written according to history, modern history, by this rabbi in Spain, this De Leon. I don't know much about him, but it's just another way of trying to understand the more esoteric and mysterious elements of God's law. It's not, it can again be misinterpreted and abused. There's a reason why, for example, in Jewish tradition, one is not supposed to study something like the Zohar or such esoteric texts until they reach certain credentials. Number one, you have to be over 40 years old. You have to be a male. You have to be bar mitzvahed. You have to have a reputation in your community of moral standing. You have to be married with children. You have to have a profession. I mean, there are all these standards that prove that you're mature enough to delve into these kinds of esoteric texts. But what's happened is you have these magicians, both Jewish and non, by the way. I mean, like John Dee was a non-Jewish magician who influenced Queen Elizabeth of England with this sort of esoteric stuff, who take these doctrines and they abuse them by trying to develop what I would argue are satanic practices around them. So the problem with study of Kabbalah is that it really is only the preserve of people who are mature enough and moral enough to actually do it in a way that it doesn't become abused and corrupted, which is what's happened in many cases.
See, in my study of the elite, they work in the language of symbols, as the Freemason
Indeed.
quotes. I forget the name off the top of my head, but essentially, that is the way the world elite work. They work through the esoteric. They have an exoteric story for the masses. If you ask a Freemason what they're about, they're going to tell you something about rebuilding Solomon's temple. But ultimately, they are satanic in their doctrine, and they are Luciferian in their initiations and their secret oaths that are bloodthirsty and evil, and they are admittedly Luciferian and satanic, and they admittedly actually lie to their lower levels. So I don't blame people joining it for the social club, but at the higher levels, they say we're Luciferian and we lie to the low levels. They're stupid. And that's something that you can see in the Admiral Pike and other leading
I agree with you on
Freemason
that.
books.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I mean,
it's
I
the
think
same
that,
thing
that
with everyone else. There's an exoteric lie for the masses, and then there's the esoteric truth, which is always different, unfortunately.
look, I mean,
And this is
the
one of those
Masonic movement,
situations.
the Masonic movement is a secret society. It was infiltrated by Adam Weishaupt of the Illuminati, who basically got into the inner core of it. This was written about by President George Washington when he was asked by a Protestant minister. He said, "What do you think about your own Masonic lodge? I mean, don't you think it was infiltrated by the Illuminati?" This is available at Mount Vernon. I mean, you could look at this document where he writes him back saying, "Yes, I do understand the diabolical," he says, "nature of the Illuminati and that it's infiltrated Masonic lodges in Europe. But I don't believe," and maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong. He said that he did not believe that they had infiltrated his lodge in Alexandria, Virginia, and that he was not a
Oh no.
part of it. He didn't really go for that. I will tell you this: when I
Well,
was in Washington D.C., I actually went to that Alexandria, Virginia Masonic lodge because I'm interested in that history and in Albert Pike and morals and dogma and all of that, just like you are. I kind of have studied it, and it is satanic. And you go into that place, and it is pretty strange. And it calls for a one world religion, a one world order, and it has all
yeah.
this drenched in symbols that have all these double and triple meanings. And that has led me to really believe, and I agree with you on this, that our entire society is drenched in these kinds of symbols. You can see them everywhere. I mean, they're in the logos of
Yeah,
businesses, and
the
and
language
they,
of symbols.
you take a look at the
In
symbol of
fact,
Amazon, right? It's an
it
erect penis. That's what it is. Once you see it, you
yeah.
can't unsee it. So I agree with you
Well,
on this.
so there are symbolism deserves its own commentary. Just quickly about the
Exactly.
Tower of Babel situation, especially since we're talking about Freemasons. The Hudibrastic poem that the Freemasons reference is quote, "If history be not ancient fable, then Freemasonry began at the Tower of Babel." And that's the actual teachings that they teach, is that Nimrod in Babel was the founder of the Freemason movement. So it was always sort of Illuminati, so to speak, and it was always sort
Right.
of antichrist in its nature. And they've been waging war against the Christians and the Catholic Church exoterically, ostensibly, for a long time, although the Catholic Church themselves were satanic in nature. So it was really just a useful
Well, I don't
enemy.
know if I agree with you on
Uh,
that. And I also would argue they've waged war against religious Judaism as well. And as far as them being going back to Nimrod, Nimrod tried to overthrow God in heaven by killing God. That's why he built that tower. He wanted to go to the top of the tower, pull out his sword, and slay God and make man the ruler of the universe. That is the origins of the New World Order movement. As far as Masonry goes, they claim to go back to Nimrod. I don't know that. I mean, I think that they probably started out as an honest guild of Masons, people who are builders, and then it was infiltrated by these evil forces because of its secretiveness. I think the Catholic Church, I mean, as much as I admire the Catholic Church, they have some of these same problems because of their secretiveness and their hierarchy. We don't know what's going on in the inner core of that church, and that there are certain indications that emanate out of it, which indicate that some of those things are not good and are not biblical and spiritual. But for the most part, I think the Catholic Church is a force for good. That's my opinion.
well, I would love to talk about the Catholic Church sometime. I'll save that one
Yeah,
for the debate that's coming up.
I'd
They
like to
reached out
hear
to me
that,
this time, and
Dustin.
they really wanted to. Yeah,
But we're
it was
kind of
fun.
reaching. We've already
Yeah,
been
I'm
we've
looking
been
forward
talking
to it.
for and I'd like to have you back because it's a great series, and I admire your scholarship, even if I don't agree on specifics. You're sincere, you're God fearing, your heart's in the right place, and so I really want to support you and your work for that reason. Can you let my listeners and viewers know how they can reach you, how they can find out about more about your work?
Sure. So DustinNemos.com has some of my interviews and some quotes and such about my work. And it takes you to my two main websites, Exoteric, what's happening in the news internationally, locally, kind of Armageddon, essentially. That's at nemosnewsnetwork.com. And esoterically, we have the biggest, at least English speaking archive of esoteric and hidden history and forbidden science and anthropology in the world at theserapeum.com. I hope people will back these things up, and this is the stuff that's being disappeared from the internet as fast as they can rewrite history. So, these are sort of my passions,
Mhm.
just waking people up and spreading the truth. So if you're interested, you can check them out there.
And also, I'd like to talk with you sometime about your involvement in the QAnon question, but that's another subject for another day.
Quite a
Um,
story, yeah.
oh, indeed. All right, so Dustin Nemos, we shall do it again soon, and God bless and thank you and be well. And I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Charles.